Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing another Sharks player review. We're coming down to just the last two players to talk about, and I went back and forth on which of them I would end up talking about in this video, but in the end, I settled on former Sharks defenseman Calen Addison. The reason I can say former is that the Sharks did not give him a qualifying offer, relinquishing his restricted free agent rights, and so he has become an unrestricted free agent, in which the Sharks will not bother to bring back. And the reason for that is that he simply was not good. That's why he is the second most disappointing player for the San Jose Sharks this past season, in my opinion. Now, Calen Addison only played this past year for San Jose. His story with the team is relatively short. In fact, he wasn't even on the roster for Game 1 of the regular season. This is because the Sharks were hopeful that going into the regular season, they would be able to fill in the void left by Erik Karlsson with one of the defensemen that they already had. Obviously, no one would come close to the offensive impact that Karlsson did have, but if someone could step up and have like a 30-point season, things would end up being relatively okay. Whether that ended up being, Mario Ferraro, Jan Ruda, Henry Thrun, it didn't really matter as long as someone was able to do it. But after watching the Sharks lose the first 11 games of the season, it was quite clear that that was not going to happen. And so Mike Grier, without breaking the bank, wanted to make a move to bring in a more offensively inclined defenseman. And that ended up being Calen Addison from the Minnesota Wild. The Sharks traded Adam Raska, a prospect who was likely not to amount to much, as well as a 5th-round pick to bring over Addison. He had put up over a 30-point pace with the Minnesota Wild in the previous season, was already looking okay with the Wild to start the year, but because he was unpredictable defensively, not very reliable in that area, and the Wild had some playoff aspirations, he became an expendable asset for them, and the Sharks pick him up. They are no strangers to offensive defensemen who aren't very good in their own end. They've been dealing with that for the better part of a decade, and so as long as Addison could come in and be like a 30-point guy, even if he wasn't super reliable in his own zone, that would be a success for the San Jose Sharks. But that did not end up being the case. If we take a look at his stats, 60 games played, counting strictly only the games he played with the San Jose Sharks, 1 goal, 11 assists for just 12 points. That is just 1 point every 5 games. Not only does this not lead all Sharks defensemen in points, this is even tied with a player like Marc-Edouard Vlasic. And the word offensive is not a word I would ever use to describe Marc-Edouard Vlasic's play. So the fact that Calen Addison only manages to tie him in terms of points and in fact get heavily outscored in terms of goals with just 1 compared to Marc-Edouard Vlasic's 6 is a massive disappointment and a huge underwhelming performance compared to what the Sharks thought that they would be getting. They were hopeful Addison could be a relatively serviceable top power play guy to avoid the Sharks having to run their incredibly volatile 5-forward power play unit, but by near the end part of the season, the Sharks weren't even bothering to use Addison in that role, and instead we're trialing other players because Addison did absolutely nothing to prove himself as a viable option in that position. If you were to ask me to count the amount of strong offensive games that Addison had this past season, I could count that on just one hand, and I probably wouldn't even be raising all 5 fingers on said hand because those games were exceptionally rare, if they even could be pointed out at all. On the defensive side of things, things were no better. Obviously, it was said that Addison wasn't going to excel in that area, but I feel as though he even underwhelmed there as well, even if the expectations were already set very, very low. This was not a situation like with Kyle Burroughs, where he was given really, really tough minutes way above his pay grade. Burroughs getting those top minutes on the top unit for the San Jose Sharks. Instead, Calen Addison was pretty much glued to the third pairing with players like Marc-Edouard Vlasic and Nikita Ahutyuk, and yet even in those easier matchups, as easy as they could get at the NHL level, Addison struggled immensely. He would lose every net front battle. He would lose every board battle. I had mentioned at some point this season that Calen Addison has never seen a battle on the ice that he couldn't lose because he was just clearly outmuscled and outmatched in pretty much every defensive situation. You look at a player like Erik Karlsson, who has his struggles absolutely in the defensive zone, but he also has his positives. While he might not be going for those tense net front battles and truly clearing the way for his goaltender, he reads the play exceptionally well, and he's able to break up passes with his stick, and not only that, but instead of just icing the puck, carry the puck out of the zone so that the Sharks would keep possession. Calen Addison has no such strengths in his defensive play. Not only is he losing all of these battles, but he's not even reading the play particularly well. And so he's pretty much just hemmed into his own zone, not really providing any positive aspects to the San Jose Sharks. And so I watched Calen Addison constantly get outmuscled with his relatively small 5'11 frame, and I think back to the NHL entry draft from a couple of months ago where the Sharks and Mike Greer had a really tough call to make at 11th overall to decide whether they wanted to bring in Sam Dickinson, who they would eventually end up drafting, or Zeev Buium. And while this is purely speculation, I wonder if, having watched Calen Addison for the entire year, a defenseman who was somewhat gifted offensively, obviously nowhere near the level of Zeev Buium, but was relatively undersized defensively, struggles so immensely, actually ended up making the decision somewhat easier. When you take a look at Sam Dickinson at his 6'3" frame, a more safe, physically imposing option compared to the more run-of-the-mill average-sized 6-foot defenseman that Zeev Buium was. So again, purely speculation. I'm not saying it is entirely Calen Addison's fault, but it does make you wonder whether or not Mike Greer wanted to avoid that potential situation from actually occurring again. If we take a look at his plus-minus, his minus 35 is obviously quite bad. If you were to put that over a full 82-game season, it would get relatively close to a minus 50 rating, which just goes to show not only how bad he was defensively, but also that he was contributing very little offensively at even strength to actually accumulate those pluses on the ice. And then if we take a look at his time on ice, 17 minutes, 21 seconds. This might seem relatively high, but that is for a couple of reasons. For one, since the Sharks don't really have multiple minute-munching defensemen on the back end outside of Mario Ferraro, the even third-pairing defenseman will have decent enough minutes. But on top of that, it should be noted that even though he was a third-pairing defenseman, Calen Addison still got a pretty hefty amount of power play ice time throughout the season, over 2 minutes of power play ice time per game. If we take a look at just his even-strength ice time, Addison, the only defenseman he was above, was Marc-Edouard Vlasic, even below the likes of a Nikita Hutyuk this past season. So like I said, quite clear that David Quinn was only really comfortable usually using him in a third pairing role, and he even disappointed immensely in that very, very minor position. And so when it comes to his grade, Calen Addison, I gave quarterly grades throughout this season to all of the players: first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter. Calen Addison was the only player throughout the season to actually get the grade of an F at some point. And while he will marginally manage to avoid that for his yearly total grade, it is only by a very, very, very thin amount, as Calen Addison indeed was quite disappointing to watch throughout this season. It is a good thing that the Sharks decided to not bring him back. He was quite bad, and as such, he gets the grade of a D-. Class dismissed.